Imagine the unimaginable, a man trapped in the depths of his own darkest secret. He was a father, but what he did to his daughter could never be undone. The chilling truth will shock you, twist your every thought, and leave you questioning everything. Stay tuned to uncover the terrifying story of betrayal, guilt, and the consequences that follow when a man crosses the line into horror. Don't blink, because the truth is more horrifying than you could ever imagine. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The air felt thick, stifling. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, it was suffocating. The dim light of a single lamp flickered in the corner. Shadows stretched long across the floor. A figure stood in the middle of the room, staring at a photograph. It was of her, his daughter. The photograph had been taken years ago. She was smiling then, innocent. But now, the smile was gone. The once vibrant eyes were dull, lifeless. His fingers trembled as he traced the edges of the photo. It seemed like a lifetime ago that they had been happy. He could still hear her laughter echoing in his mind. But that laughter had turned to silence. And now, he stood alone in the house that had once been filled with her presence. His heart raced. A surge of panic coursed through his veins. What had he done? The weight of his actions pressed down on him, suffocating him. His mind flashed back to the night it all began. She had come to him, asking for help. A father's help. But that help had turned into something darker. Something twisted. Something unforgivable. Her eyes had pleaded with him, begging for comfort, for reassurance. But he had only given her something far worse. Something he couldn't take back. He could still feel her touch, the warmth of her skin. It sickened him now. The guilt was overwhelming. The memory of her final moments haunted him. He had married her. He had taken her innocence, her trust. And then he had ended it all. A brutal, violent act that no one would ever understand. The room seemed to close in on him. The walls felt like they were pressing against his chest. He gasped for air, but it was no use. The past had caught up with him. And now, there was no escape. The house creaked, as if it too was mourning. Every corner of the room held a memory. A whisper.
A sigh.
The walls seemed to know. They had witnessed everything. The cruel transformation of a man who was once a father. But now a monster. He closed his eyes, trying to block it out. The memory of that night flooded his mind. The darkened hallway, the cold touch of the door handle, the muffled footsteps as she walked toward him. She was trembling. He could hear her heart beat faster as she got closer. His breath caught in his throat. The air had been thick with anticipation. But what followed was nothing like he had expected. Her eyes, wide with confusion, fear.
She didn't understand.
Not at first. Not until it was too late. He had wanted her, not just as his daughter, but as something more. Something he could control. Her face had twisted in horror. Her voice cracked as she begged him to stop. But the urge, the desire, consumed him. He couldn't stop. The rage inside him flared, like a wildfire. And, in that moment, he had felt powerful. But now, with the passing days, that power felt like poison. The regret gnawed at him. The emptiness was unbearable. And yet, he had done it. He had murdered her. His daughter. The last thing he could remember was her terrified eyes. The pleading look she had given him. And then nothing. Just the cold silence of the house. The police would come eventually. But would they ever understand? Would anyone believe the truth? He laughed bitterly to himself. There was no escaping it. He had destroyed everything. His family. His life. And most painfully her. All of it was gone. And there was no turning back. The night stretched on, endless in its weight. He could feel the chill seeping into his bones. The walls, once familiar, now seemed foreign, suffocating. He tried to move, but his legs felt heavy, like they were filled with lead. The darkness closed in around him, pressing against his skin. Every corner of the house was a reminder of what he had done, what he had taken. Her laughter, her warmth gone. His mind screamed for peace, but it would never come. He glanced at the clock on the wall. The seconds ticked by, each one like a hammer on his skull. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by his shallow breaths. Suddenly, the sound of a knock at the door. Sharp, unyielding. His heart leaped into his throat. Who was it? The police? Had they finally discovered what he had done? He stood frozen, staring at the door. Every muscle in his body tensed. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He moved slowly, almost cautiously, toward the door. The sound of his footsteps seemed to echo, magnifying the tension. When he reached for the handle, his hands shook uncontrollably. The door creaked open. The figure on the other side was silhouetted in the dim light.
A man.
A stranger. His heart pounded in his chest as he searched the man's face. Was it the police?
No.
It wasn't. But the stranger's eyes. There was something in them. Recognition. The man stepped forward, his voice low and steady. You think you can hide from this? The words hit him like a slap. He froze, unable to speak. The man knew. Somehow he knew everything. He stepped further into the room. The smell of cigarettes clung to him. His gaze never left the father. A moment of tense silence hung between them. And then, in the stillness, the truth felt like it was suffocating him. This man, this was no stranger. This was a part of his past. A reminder of the horror that had started it all. The story wasn't over. It had only just begun. The stranger's gaze pierced through him, as if reading his very soul. The silence between them grew thick, suffocating. His heart beat faster, louder. Each thud was like a drum, echoing in the empty room. The man's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. Did you think you could escape it? The stranger asked, his voice chillingly calm. The father's throat tightened. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His mind raced, searching for a way out. But there was no escape. Not now. The stranger took another step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. Every inch closer felt like a tightening noose. The man's eyes flicked to the photograph still clutched in the father's trembling hand. The smile grew wider. You thought it was over, the man said softly, almost mocking. But it's just beginning. A chill ran down the father's spine. The weight of those words crushed him. He wanted to run, to hide, but his legs were frozen. The stranger's presence was overpowering, suffusing the room with a dark energy. You think you can bury your sins, the man continued, his voice like ice. There's no burying the truth. The father felt the walls closing in, the room spinning around him. He struggled to breathe, his chest tightening with panic. But there was no escape. The man's eyes never left him, unwavering. His heart pounded in his ears, deafening, relentless. I know what you did, the stranger whispered, his voice now a venomous hiss. Do you know what it feels like to be hunted? The father's legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he couldn't look away from the man. The stranger was right. There was no hiding, no redemption. His past had come for him, and it would never let go. The room felt darker now, the air heavier. His breath was shallow, each one a struggle. He could feel his own life slipping away, piece by piece. The stranger stepped forward again, his shadow swallowing the father whole. The past was no longer a distant memory. It was here, and there would be no escape. The stranger crouched before him, their faces inches apart. The father's breath hitched as the man's icy gaze bored into his soul. Every part of him screamed to look away, but his body betrayed him. He was trapped, cornered in a nightmare he had never imagined. You thought you could bury it, the stranger whispered, voice smooth like velvet, yet cutting deep. But the truth, it always finds its way. The words wrapped around him, tightening like a vice. The father's mind swirled, desperate for an explanation, for any reason to deny this terrible reality. But there was none. The stranger reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small object. A photograph. The father's breath caught as he recognized it. It was her, his daughter. The same photo from years ago. But this time, her eyes were filled with terror. Her face was bloodied, twisted in a final expression of fear. The father recoiled, his body trembling. "Did you think you could silence her forever?" the stranger murmured, his words like poison. "I've been waiting, watching. And now the world will know." His hands shook uncontrollably as he reached for the photo. He needed to destroy it. He needed to erase the truth. But the stranger didn't let him. "Don't bother," he said, his tone mocking. "The truth is already out." The father's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the irreversible act he had committed. It was all crashing down. The walls were closing in on him. He could feel the weight of his guilt, dragging him deeper into the darkness. I never wanted this," he whispered, barely audible. Tears blurred his vision. The stranger's smile widened, a sick satisfaction in his eyes. "You wanted her," he said coldly. "And now you'll pay for it." The father's mind reeled. He had never imagined it would come to this. He had been a man, a father, who had crossed the line, and now he was nothing. The air felt suffocating, the silence unbearable. And in that moment, the truth was all-consuming. There would be no redemption. There would be no forgiveness. Only the consequences. The stranger stood up, towering over him. "Enjoy your last moments," he said, his voice laced with finality. And then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. The father remained on the floor, broken, shivering with the weight of what he had done. As the door closed behind the stranger, the house fell into an eerie silence. And all that remained was the deafening sound of the father's broken heart. The door clicked shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the empty room. The father was alone now. But the isolation didn't bring relief. It suffocated him further. His hands were slick with sweat as he clutched the photograph to his chest, his mind spinning. His world had shattered, and there was no longer a place to hide. The room felt colder, darker. The faint smell of dust mixed with something more pungent, guilt. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he might collapse. The truth was closing in, tightening around him like a noose. He tried to stand, to move, but his body refused to cooperate. Every movement felt heavy, like wading through thick mud. His chest tightened with an unbearable weight, the pressure building with each breath. And then his eyes fell on the door. The stranger was gone, but his presence lingered like a dark cloud in the air. The father's mind screamed in agony, but the words wouldn't come. Was he being watched? Had someone known? The thought gnawed at him. Who else knew? Was there anyone left to expose the truth? He stumbled to his feet, trembling with the effort, and shuffled toward the door. His fingers brushed the handle, but he couldn't bring himself to open it. There was nothing out there for him. No safe place. No redemption. Just a waiting storm. The silence in the house felt oppressive, pressing down on him. He could hear his own heartbeat, so loud it was deafening. Was it guilt? Fear? Both? Each thought he had was drowned by the overwhelming realization of what he had done. The room began to spin again, and he dropped to his knees, gasping for air. The memory of her face, her terrified eyes, flashed in his mind. That haunting image of his daughter, her last moments, was burned into his mind, impossible to erase. The silence deepened, suffocating him further. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a flicker of hope fought to survive. But it was weak. His mind turned to the stranger's words. Pay for it. He was right. There was no escaping the truth. The past could not be buried. It would follow him, haunt him forever. And now, as the weight of it all pressed down, the father could only sit there, broken, in the cold, empty room, with nothing left but the haunting silence. The silence in the room was deafening. It was the kind of silence that echoed, bouncing off the walls, suffocating everything in its path. The father's breath was shallow, strained, as if each inhale was a struggle. His mind refused to let go of the image of her, his daughter's face. Her eyes, filled with terror and confusion, flashing before him like a nightmare that wouldn't end. He pressed his palms against his temples, trying to block out the memories. But they came flooding back with a vengeance. The fear, the screams, her desperate pleas for him to stop. He wanted to scream, to release the agony that gnawed at his insides, but no sound escaped him. It was as if the room itself had swallowed him whole, trapping him in a prison of his own making. Each breath felt like it was being stolen from him. His body trembled uncontrollably. He couldn't escape the suffocating weight of what he had done. It was too much to carry, too much to live with. And as the darkness around him deepened, he knew that no matter how hard he tried, there was no way to undo the past. There was no redemption, no forgiveness. His mind flickered to the stranger, the man who had come to him with that chilling smile and those cold, knowing eyes. He had been the harbinger of truth, the one who had come to make him face what he had buried. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The father's gaze fell to the photograph again, his fingers trembling as he traced the edges. The truth was there. It would always be there. He thought about the stranger's final words. "Enjoy your last moments." It hit him with brutal clarity. The stranger hadn't just come to expose him. He had come to bear witness. To make sure the father understood. There was no escape. Not from the truth. Not from his guilt. And certainly not from the inevitable consequences of his actions. The father looked around the room one last time, taking in the silent shadows that clung to the corners. It was a cold, hollow space now. There was no warmth, no comfort. Just the oppressive weight of everything he had lost. And everything he had destroyed. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier, as if even the house itself knew what he had done. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the suffocating presence of his past. But it wouldn't go away. It never would. His eyes snapped open, and the cold reality of his surroundings hit him harder than before. The silence, once a blanket, now felt like a constant pressure, pushing against him from every side. His chest ached with every breath, the weight of his own guilt settling deeper inside him. He thought of her again. Her smile. Her innocence. And then her final, terrified cry. The father's hands balled into fists, the knuckles white from the tension. He felt trapped in his own skin, as though he were suffocating on the very air around him. His body, too, was betraying him, trembling uncontrollably, his muscles locking in place. The thought of what he had done consumed him, swallowed him whole. He had been a father. He had promised to protect her. But instead, he had destroyed her. He had taken everything that had made her who she was. And, in the process, he had lost himself. The room felt even smaller now, the walls closing in tighter. The shadows seemed to grow longer, darker, as if they were coming for him. He couldn't escape them, couldn't escape her face, her voice calling out to him, begging for help. But he hadn't helped her. He had condemned her. A bitter laugh escaped him, though it held no humor. The stranger's words played in his mind again. The truth always finds its way. How right the man had been. The truth had found him, and now there was no escaping it. He had once thought that maybe, just maybe, he could outrun the consequences. That he could bury his sins deep enough to never feel the weight of them again. But now, as he sat in the dark room, there was no denying the truth. He had murdered her. And the walls, the shadows, the silence, everything around him, was now a reminder of his own crime. No matter how many times he tried to shut his eyes, to block it all out, it never left. The door was closed, but the weight of the world had entered through every crack in the room. He felt the suffocation of it, his chest tightening as though the air itself was turning to stone. The sound of his own heartbeat seemed deafening, a cruel reminder of how alive he was while she was gone. A fleeting thought passed through his mind. Would it have been better to have ended it all? To stop breathing, to stop feeling? But even that thought, no matter how tempting, felt wrong. He wasn't ready to face what awaited him on the other side.
No.
He was stuck here, in the hell he had created. And with each passing moment, the silence grew heavier, the air thicker. There would be no escape from it now. Not from the truth. Not from the past. The air around him felt suffocating, thick with the weight of his own torment. His chest heaved with each shallow breath, but it wasn't enough. The air felt too thin, too tight. He wanted to scream, to let out the pain that had built up inside him, but no sound came. The silence in the room pressed harder, wrapping tighter around him like a vice. His eyes darted to the photograph again, the one still clutched in his trembling hands. It was as though it had become a part of him, its image burned into his mind. Her face, frozen in time, her innocence, her trust, destroyed by his own actions. His stomach churned, a sickening, gnawing feeling that wouldn't let go. He thought back to the night it all started. The night everything had spiraled out of control. The confusion in her eyes. The disbelief. The terror. The way she had tried to escape, but he had stopped her. He had taken everything from her. The love of a father, twisted into something monstrous. The guilt, the shame, the horror of his actions suffocated him. He wanted to crawl into a hole and disappear, to escape the weight of his conscience. But the truth wouldn't let him. It was here in the room with him. It was in the air he breathed, in every shadow, in every flicker of light. The truth was suffocating him. There was no running from it. He had done the unthinkable. He had killed her. The walls of the house seemed to close in further, the room narrowing around him, leaving no space to breathe. No space to think. His head was spinning, drowning in the suffocating guilt. His eyes darted to the window, the darkness outside an oppressive void. But even that darkness felt lighter than the one consuming him from within. The past was a living thing now. It haunted him, breathing down his neck, always present, always waiting. It was his shadow, his burden. And he could feel it closing in on him, inch by inch. There was no peace for him, no escape. Not in this life. Not in any other. His hands shook violently now, and he dropped the photograph onto the floor, unable to hold it any longer. He closed his eyes, but the image of her, of what he had done, was seared into his mind. It would never go away. The truth was here, and it would never leave him. He could feel his sanity slipping away, unraveling with every passing second. His mind screamed for release, but there was no release. Not anymore. Not for him. The darkness had already claimed him, and it would never let him go. The darkness around him seemed to expand, swallowing everything, suffocating his very sense of self. He could no longer separate himself from it, from the twisted knot of his actions. The walls seemed to pulse with the beat of his own broken heart, each thump a constant reminder of the life he had destroyed. His eyes flickered, unable to stay focused. His body trembled, his hands gripping the edges of the chair he had collapsed into, desperate for something, anything, to ground him. But nothing was real anymore. Everything was consumed by the guilt that gnawed at his soul, turning every thought, every memory, into something dark and twisted. The clock on the wall ticked, each passing second mocking him, reminding him of how much time had slipped away, time that could never be reclaimed. He could hear his breath, shallow and rapid, like a drowning man gasping for air. But the air, the room, the house, it was all closing in on him. He thought of the stranger again, the man who had appeared out of nowhere, only to reveal what he already knew, that the truth had found its way to him. And now, the truth was all that remained. He wanted to get up, to run, but his body refused to obey. His legs were heavy, his mind numb, like his entire existence had been drained of meaning. The photograph still lay on the floor, its image staring up at him, accusing him. He couldn't bear to look at it anymore. But it was impossible to look away. He tried to push himself up from the chair, but the effort was too much. It felt as if the weight of his guilt was pressing down on him from every direction, crushing him, suffocating him with its sheer force. His head spun, and for a moment, he thought he might lose himself completely.
But there was no losing it now.
No forgetting. Not after everything he had done. He looked around the room once more, but it had become a blur, the edges of his vision swimming with dizziness. Everything felt unreal, as though the house itself was closing in on him. The shadows seemed to move, to reach for him, and he could feel them crawling along his skin, wrapping around him, suffocating him. It was the truth. The truth was everywhere. There was no escape, no reprieve. The door to his past had been thrown wide open, and now it was too late to close it. And as the darkness enveloped him completely, as his mind fractured under the weight of his guilt, one final thought flickered through his head. He would never be free. Not from her. Not from himself. The truth would follow him, haunt him, until the very end. And there would be no escape from it. The shadows continued to creep, curling around him like cold, unyielding chains. Each breath he took felt heavier than the last, his lungs struggling to pull in air that seemed too thick, too contaminated with his sins. The room had become a prison, every inch of space soaked in the overwhelming stench of regret. Every sound, the ticking clock, his own ragged breath, felt like a drumbeat heralding his inevitable collapse. He closed his eyes, but it didn't matter. The image of her face, her last moments, was burned into his mind. No matter how hard he tried to block it out, her screams echoed in the corners of his mind, relentless and deafening. He could feel her presence, even though she was no longer here. It was as though her spirit lingered in the room, her anger and pain settling over him like a suffocating blanket. His hands shook and his chest tightened. He felt like he was drowning, unable to find an escape from the whirlpool of guilt that had swallowed him whole. A knock at the door. It was sharp, sudden, and it sent a jolt through his body. He froze, his heart leaping into his throat.
Who could it be?
Was it the stranger again? Or had the truth finally caught up to him in the most terrible way? He didn't move. The room was still. The knock came again, louder this time. The pressure inside him grew, his mind racing. The walls felt like they were closing in faster, the air growing even heavier. What did they want? Was this the end? But he couldn't bring himself to open the door. He couldn't face anyone.
Not now.
Not ever. The silence stretched again, but it was different now. There was no peace in it, only the unbearable weight of everything he had done. His mind swirled in a haze of fragmented thoughts. The knock echoed in his ears, each one louder than the last. He finally stood, legs unsteady beneath him, as if his body didn't recognize the man it was supposed to be. His hands were trembling violently, sweat dripping from his forehead. He staggered to the door, unable to find his balance, unable to steady his breath. Every movement felt like it was in slow motion, the world tilting with each step. When he reached the door, he paused, his fingers hovering over the doorknob. His pulse hammered in his ears. The knock came once more, sharp and insistent. But still, he couldn't move. He could feel her eyes on him, her accusing stare burning into his soul. Her presence was everywhere. And then, as if by fate, the door creaked open. The cold air from the hallway swept in, and for a moment, everything stood still. There was no one there, just the empty darkness of the hallway stretching beyond. And yet, despite the emptiness, he felt like he was being watched. He stepped outside, feeling the cool night air hit his skin, but it brought no relief. The darkness outside mirrored the one inside him. And as he stood there, caught in the suffocating quiet of his own thoughts, he realized No one was coming to save him. No one would. The past had already consumed him. And now, the truth would forever be his only companion. The cold night air pressed against him, but it did nothing to quell the fire burning inside him. The silence of the empty hallway felt like a void, echoing the emptiness inside. He stood frozen, the door hanging slightly ajar behind him, its darkness seeping into the room, into his soul. His mind was unraveling, spiraling deeper with every passing second. There was nothing here but the oppressive weight of what he had done. He wanted to turn back, to retreat into the house, to hide from the consequences. But the truth, the terrible, unforgiving truth, followed him, clinging to him like a shadow. There was nowhere to run. His body trembled, and his hands shook so violently he could barely keep them steady. His thoughts felt fragmented, broken. The door, the hallway, the house, it all seemed to distort before him, as if the world itself was bending under the weight of his guilt. His legs gave out, and he collapsed to his knees, unable to hold himself up any longer. He gasped for air, each breath ragged, painful. The past was here, suffocating him. He could still hear her voice, a whisper in the wind, his daughter's voice, calling for help. Her pain had never left him. It would never leave him. The truth was there in the empty space around him, in every shadow, in every gust of cold air that touched his skin.
It was impossible to escape.
And as he knelt there, his mind began to fragment even further, the weight of his actions threatening to break him completely. He didn't know how much longer he could endure it. How much longer before the truth consumed him entirely. A sudden chill ran through him, a coldness that seemed to come from within. He looked up, his eyes wide, searching the empty hallway for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the darkness, waiting, as it always had. He wanted to scream, to fight against it, but his voice caught in his throat, choked by the enormity of his own sin. There was no escape, no relief, only the endless pull of guilt, dragging him deeper into the void. The sound of his own breathing was the only thing that filled the silence. A sharp, desperate breath. And then another. But even the air was no comfort. Because he knew, deep down, that no matter how many breaths he took, no matter how many times he tried to escape, he would never be free from the truth. Not from her. Not from what he had done. And as the darkness around him deepened, he realized, with a chilling certainty, he would never be able to outrun his past. It had already consumed him, and there was no way back. The cold air bit at his skin, a stark contrast to the feverish heat that consumed him from within. He tried to stand, his legs shaking uncontrollably, as if they were no longer his own. The hallway stretched before him, but it felt infinite, an endless tunnel leading nowhere. His heart pounded in his chest, the rhythm erratic, as if it, too, were uncertain of its place in the world. Everything around him seemed to blur, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered if he had already lost his mind. The truth was too heavy, too suffocating. His gaze shifted back toward the door, the one he had left ajar, the one that had once been a barrier between his actions and the world outside. Now it felt like the only thing separating him from utter collapse. The walls around him felt as though they were closing in, pressing him from every side. He staggered toward the door, his feet dragging as though they were leaden, too heavy to move. The whispers in his mind grew louder, gnawing at him, relentless in their insistence. Her face, her screams, the terror in her eyes as he had taken everything from her. He reached out for the doorframe, his fingers curling around the cold wood, and for the first time, he realized he had nothing left. No one to turn to, no place to run. Everything he had built, everything he had been, had crumbled beneath the weight of his actions. He thought back to the stranger, the man who had arrived to expose him, to bring him face to face with the nightmare he had created. The man had warned him, "You will pay." He hadn't fully understood it at the time. But now, in this moment, it was clear. He had already paid. And he would continue to pay for the rest of his life. The pain was unbearable. The guilt, the regret, it was a constant, suffocating presence, like a vice tightening around his chest. His legs gave way again, and he collapsed onto the floor, the weight of it all finally crashing down on him. The world spun, and his vision blurred. But even as his mind shattered, he knew one thing for certain. There was no forgiveness. There was no escape. And as the darkness took over, swallowing him whole, he was left with only one undeniable truth. He was trapped. Forever. The room was silent now, the oppressive weight of it all hanging in the air like a thick fog. The darkness had settled over him completely, and for the first time, in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to finally surrender to it. His body, once trembling, had gone still, and his thoughts, too, had grown distant, like fading echoes that barely reached his consciousness. He thought of her again, of her innocence, her smile before everything had shattered. It was a memory that hurt more than anything else, a sharp pang that cut through the fog of guilt and despair that clouded his mind. But even that, he realized, was a distant ache now. Her face had already become part of the darkness that surrounded him, a part of the very weight he carried. And as the final remnants of his strength drained away, he understood something terrible yet undeniable. There was no redemption for him. Not anymore. The man who had once been her father, the man who had promised to protect her, was gone. All that was left now was the hollow shell of a person who had lost everything, who had destroyed the one thing that had ever mattered. The house felt distant now, an empty structure with no warmth, no life, no future. The shadows had claimed it, just as they had claimed him. He closed his eyes one last time, and for a fleeting moment, he felt something resembling peace. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't release. It was simply the end. The end of the torment. The end of the endless struggle to outrun the truth. The end of the long, suffocating silence that had filled his every waking moment. He had been lost long before the stranger had come, before the truth had finally shattered the fragile life he had built. But now, in this final, quiet moment, there was nothing left to fight, nothing left to face. And as the darkness pressed in one last time, he finally accepted what he could no longer deny. He was finally free. Free from the guilt. Free from the pain. Free from the consequences of his actions. And that was the cruelest freedom of all.